Hello, welcome to the first episode of the second season of Me-Thinks. I am here today with Mike Sylvester. Mike, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Jamie. Appreciate it.
You represent the east end of Portland, Upper Bayside, and many of the islands.
Many of the Casco Bay Islands, that's correct, yeah.
And we know each other through the local comedy scene.
Right.
So I think to start off for our first episode of the second season, we already lost the majority of the people who would watch this show on YouTube. According to Google YouTube Analytics, people will stop watching right now.
All right, well, it's been a pleasure being on.
Yeah, so hopefully we can hold on to some more, Mike. And you're actually our first guest who has crossover because your constituents are conceivably maybe tuning in to this channel.
They could be watching.
So I want to start off with the issue of engaging the viewer, engaging the voter. Because we know each other through comedy, and in comedy there's a concept of a tight five. Are you familiar with this?
Yes, I am.
Can you explain this to the...
So the idea is that you have a set that is timed, that you can deliver again and again for a specific amount of time, because when you're on stage, there's a light that comes on at 30 seconds. And so you want to be able to tell all of your jokes and end at the end of 5 minutes on a strong joke that sort of ties everything in together. And so you have a through line within the 5. It's where you end up at the 5 and you're satisfied.
Yes.
With the last strong laugh.
And you're not going into any other comedian's time.
Right, exactly.
So do you have a tight 5 in politics?
I do. It's interesting because people will call you up a lot of times and they'll say, can you come speak at this meeting? And they'll say, you have 15 minutes to talk about this, and then you show up and they go, oh, we invited 6 other people. You've got 4 minutes to explain this really complex issue. And so one of the things that you learn to think about is, what are the basics that you need to give to folks to not only explain the issue, but to inspire them that they might care about it.
Okay, great. Okay, so we're going to start off. We have 3 questions for you. The first question for you will be an easy one. And we're going to time. These are going to be timed. So instead of a tight 5 or tight 4, we're going to have you do a tight 3. You're going to answer the question once. You're going to have 3 minutes. Then you will start over. You get to answer the same question with 1 minute.
Yep.
And then we'll go down to 30 seconds and then 15 seconds.
All right.
And if you go over time, we'll hear this sound. So a mildly, that sound. That will be the sound that you'll hear.
So the Marine horn, not
yes, exactly.
So the air horn, not the static cling. That's what.
Yeah, hopefully.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good.
All right, so first question, Mike. I'm going to start the time, is right after I finish asking the question, is why should people in your district vote for you?
I think it's a really interesting question about running for office in the first place, right? Because many of the folks, many of the discussions that happen about policy up in Augusta are all often intermingled with what are my constituents going to say about this? What's going to happen in re-election? Am I going to get a nasty postcard at the if I vote for this or if I advocate for this policy? And here's what I believe. I believe that they say economic science, right? The economics is the dismal science, right?
Yep.
I believe
that's an operator error. We put you on the wrong clock, Mike.
That's
but,
all right.
I guess
No worries.
It all comes with the territory. I'll just let you go ahead. I feel like 3 minutes is a long time for you.
I can wrap up really quickly.
You got like 2 minutes. You can keep going.
So as I was saying, economic science, right, is the dismal science because you can prove anything by manipulating the numbers, right? I believe that political science is the deceitful science, right? Because in order to engage in political life in this country at this moment in history, I have to lie, right? I have to say that you're worse than you are if I'm running against you, and I have to say that I'm better than I am in order to win votes. And one of the big sort of discussions right now is how the left, which I am firmly embossed in, how the left runs for elections and wins. But to me, the more interesting question is how we win and then govern from the left. And so I say this, right? I say that when you're running for election, you already have to have a theory of how you're going to govern, right? And so when you are knocking on doors, right, some people will tell you, oh, don't be very clear about what you're going to, what you believe. You don't want to be trapped in your values, right? And this is advice that political scientists give, right? But I believe you tell people exactly what you stand for. Because if you don't know those things, then why are you running? And when I first decided to run, I sat down with my family and we came up with our list of things, because I said to my sons, it's going to be an enormous pain in the behind to be the son of a representative, because if you mess up now, the only people who know, right, are the people maybe on the island and maybe a few other folks. But if you mess up then the forecaster or the Ballard is going to run an article about it, right? And so we came up with our list of...
God forbid the Ballard run an article.
Oh, I know it, right? It's coming now that I've called them out, right? But we came up with our list of dream things. This is what we'd want to fix. And my little guy looked at me and said, can't be incremental change, right? We've got to do big things, right? And if you don't know what those big things are, if you don't know what your values are, if you are running because you think it would be neat or because somebody said you should, right? You should not be in politics, right? Because there's so many hard choices where you're taking your best guess on a bunch of really complicated issues that you knew nothing about until this bill landed in your lap, right? And you have to learn, and if you don't have a system of values, and I'll just say...
All right, somebody was keeping track of the time.
Very good.
If you don't have a system of values...
Then I'll just wrap up by saying Peter Stuckey, who used to be a legislator from this district for a long time, used to say, I was elected so I can govern. I don't govern so I can get elected.
Okay, all right. I think I messed up this whole thing. This is
That's
garbage.
all good.
This time gag thing is garbage.
It's going to be gold when you got it right. It's going to be gold, Jerry.
No, actually, I want to wrap this up real quick. Let's just do 30 seconds and 15 seconds.
Yes, totally cool.
And so for the first question, and we'll come back to the stuff that you just brought up. You just brought up a lot of big things. So part of me is like, well, why don't we just have a discussion, a conversation?
Right. Yeah,
but let's do this because I said we were going to do this, and then we'll just move on from this garbage bit. And don't tune out.
Gold coming.
So for the first question is, what is democratic socialism? Mm-hmm. How is it different from regular socialism? And what are the goals of a democratic socialist within a capitalist society?
So regular socialism wants to overturn the capitalist system in order to set up an entirely new system. Democratic socialism has the same values as socialism, but works within the existing system to bring around socialist values. And so it was one of the big questions when I decided to run as a Democrat was, largely because could the Democratic Party be saved from itself? And I always believe you walk in the front door and you ask for what you want.
Good job. That was a good one. Solid. All right. Let's do it in 15 seconds. You ready?
Ready.
Go.
So socialism is a system that wants to overturn capitalism utterly. Democratic socialism is a system that wants to save people from capitalism and its dire effects. And by doing that, have the people have a bigger voice in government.
Good job, Mike.
It was close.
Yeah. All right. That's enough of that. All right, Mike. Let's talk. I want to come back to this thing you just talked about with politics of deceit.
Yep.
So have you gotten better at lying since you become a politician?
I'm terrible at it, and I think that one of the reasons is I spent 20 years as a union organizer talking with workers, and I believe that workers are the smartest people in the union. They know not only the problems, but the solutions to the problems, right? And they may not be able to, have some fancy theory or poll or whatever in order to explain what it is, but they know what they need, and they know, what they think the avenue is to get there if you bother to listen to them. And so, I think that, when I was running, there was a gentleman in my district who was very hardcore Republican. And we had several conversations. He would stop me on the street every time he saw me canvassing. And he would hit me with all these hard questions, and it was great, right? And I would just tell him what I believed, and he'd say, tell me I was full of, and he didn't believe that. And I'd say, well, that's okay, but now you know where I stand. And so when it came to election day, he hit me up, again, and then he walked inside and he came out and he said, I just voted for Democratic Socialist, and I vomited a little in my mouth. But I voted for you because I never am going to have to wonder where you are. And to me, that's what saves politics in this point in history, is a bunch of people who are willing to say what they believe and to act on it, regardless of whether or not people vote them out.
Okay, yeah. And let's back up on you, and you grew up I think one thing I thought was interesting researching you is that your early story is very similar to our governor's. You grew up from humble beginnings in Lewiston, Maine.
Right.
Has anyone asked you have you ever thought about that, or how?
I'm fascinated with our governor, because our governor is very much like most of my uncles that I grew up with, right? Standing at the end of the driveway saying very much the same things that our governor says. The only difference is no one ever put a microphone in front of them or was foolish enough to give them power. And so our governor grew up very much the same way I did. I grew up very poor, single mother. We often, the food was scarce. We often didn't know why, that all the bills were going to be paid. First kid in my family to go to college, right? And but we came to very different conclusions about the world. And my conclusion was that a lot of people helped me get where I was, right? A lot of people helped me put me in a position where the sort of dimmed expectations of a dying mill city, for some reason I believed that I could go to college. Our governor seems to have gotten out of there with a sense that people owe him, that people need to be, who are in the position of poverty, God forbid, need to be punished for that position.
Well, I think maybe to be more fair to or I was kind of thinking about it, and I think the same could be said for you, but perhaps the governor thinks that his determination, his work ethic, which it sounds too from reading about you that you work very hard. So, yet when you talk about going to college, there's a certain amount where you seem to acknowledge it as help or luck, or whereas I think the governor maybe sees it as him.
Oh, sure. Yeah, and I'll be honest, when I left Lewiston, I understand his mindset, because when I left Lewiston, I was like, I'm out of here, right? I may never come back. Right, right?
And then you're not back in Lewiston.
I'm not. I've moved all over the country, working for unions and whatever, and we ended up, moving to Portland. But I think that, even in terms of the city as a whole, I thought of it as sort of an economic status that I was trying to move above, right? And I think that what I've come to understand is that we are all in that economic status. Unless you're in that 0.1%, that owns 50+% of the economy, right? You are poor. And I think that the issues that poor people deal with, right, on an everyday basis, right? I'm a WIC kid, we got food stamps, that allowed me to get where I am. And I don't forget that. And so you can either look back and say, poverty is, the situation that I was in was wrong to begin with, because this country should be able to feed and house and clothe and provide jobs, right? And the answer is either the money goes to the richest folks to figure out that problem, or the money goes back into the hands of the people. And I'm very much about, I trust the money in the hands of the people to do to start small businesses, to start co-ops, to start, right? That's where I want to see money going to. I'd rather see 50 people start companies with 10 jobs than go out and spend $5 million to bring in one company to bring in 500 $10 an hour jobs.
Uh-huh. You seem to have a very, you seem to view these issues very, political issues. You seem to talk a lot in matters of class disparity and wealth disparity. Mm-hmm. But in your history, you didn't necessarily start out in your political life as a on that avenue of liberalism.
Right.
So were you thinking about, did you think this way then when you were growing up, or did it take you a while to come to that philosophy?
So I read a lot of, I read Howard Zinn, and I read all of this philosophy. And the interesting thing is that, I read Marxist philosophy, I read, social, I read economics, I read, partly because my mom worked at Bates College, I would go and hang out in the library. And so I knew a lot of Bates students, and they'd see me reading some thick and they would think it was funny, right? Because what's this 14-year-old doing reading this book? And then they would, and as I got to know people, they'd say, oh, you got to read this, right? This is the follow-up to that, right? And so, in my head, I had all of these discussions with these authors. But to be honest with you, I didn't understand until I was graduating from college and realizing that I had to support myself as a human being in this world, that I was the poor person that was being spoken about in these books. Right?
Okay.
It didn't click in, even as I was working 40 hours a week to put myself through college with my scholarships and everything, right? That I was that poor person. And all of a sudden I realized, I said, I'm the proletariat, right? Right? And so then I had to come to the decision, right? So what do I do with that, right? I've been gifted this, right? This ability to go and think for however many years in college.
Yeah, and
right?
you were a gender studies major,
I was
right?
gender studies and creative writing, like two of the most useful things that a first person in college could get right. But all I knew how to do was think.
So how did you come to this recognition of being a proletariat?
So I started working with kids up at this, it's Camp Kiev, right? They have a thing called Leadership Decision Institute, and that was my first job out of college. And so I was dealing with these rural kids who would come in, they'd have their sex and drug education money that the federal government used to give, and I would teach communication skills and ropes course stuff, and I would start to get these letters back from kids saying, I use the iMessages that you taught us, and I said, Daddy, I am upset when you hit mommy or when you drink too much and drive your car, and he would beat me, so what do I do next? And that was when it really hit me that all of this kind of education that I had, how do you turn it into something practical? How do you turn it into something that actually changes people's lives, where it's no longer just words on a page, but it's moving people's lives? And at the same time, they messed me around about my contract. Without getting into a lot of it, I ended up at the AFL-CIO Organizing Institute.
Against Kiev, Camp Kiev?
Well, it was unclear whether or not there was going to be work and whatever, right? And so in the spring, and so I ended up at the AFL-CIO Organizing Institute, as training to become a union organizer. And what dawned on me was that if I could affect the lives of their parents, so that they weren't being disrespected at work, so that they felt that they had a voice at work, so that they had enough money that they could come home and feed their kids and feel that they were doing the job that America tells us we have to do as adults, right? Then they would bring that into the house with their kids.
Wow, Mike, that was an impressive feat of giving us a real personal first-person story of your counselor to your goals as labor organizing or workers' rights.
And I thought at that point, right, I thought, because I was a writer, right, and I wanted to try stand-up comedy. And so I thought, I'll do this for a year, maybe two, and then I'll move out to New York or LA or San Francisco, right, and I'll try comedy. And 20 years later, there I was working with the same low-wage workers that that I'd been working with all that time, and it was a very fulfilling career.
Out in where in New York?
I was all over the place. So I mean, right? I worked. I had sort of an idea of.
So I'm sorry, just to be.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah.
So you got a job working with the AFL-CIO.
So I went through their training program.
Got it.
My very first job was down in West Virginia, and so I went from this very liberal
Nurses.
college, organizing nursing home workers, and right, and all of a sudden, I'm driving down haulers, driving. Fighting through dogs to get to doors. We're driving across railroad trestle, right? And talking to real people, right? Who literally, were organizing the first nursing home that I worked on. The company was spending $500,000 to fight these workers so that they couldn't get these 60 workers couldn't get a union. And the only thing they wanted was enough supplies to be able to take care of their patients. They didn't want they were making $6 an hour at that point. They didn't want some crazy wage. They didn't want they just wanted to be able to walk into the closet when someone needed a pad on their bed and to find it there. And that was the voice that they wanted in their workplace, right? And nobody would listen to them. And this company spent all this money to fight that because they wanted to be able, that's what power is, right? You want to be able to say when and how much and how come. There's a really famous study from Harvard that they asked 500 CEOs, would you give up 10% of your power to get 20% more profit? And 90% of them said no.
Yeah, I guess that would make sense.
People want to have control.
Yeah, I'm just still stuck on this. All they wanted was pads for the people they worked with. They didn't want anything else.
Literally the nicest people that I've ever met.
That just seems like a lot of work for them to just. They must have wanted more.
But that's what made them call the union.
I get it. Yeah, there was a need enough for that there's.
And that when I would talk to workers, I talked to a lot of workers that I said, you know what, you're not ready to have a union because they just wanted more money. Right. And if I'm the company and I know that they just want more money, I'll just give them more money, and then it goes away. Right. There's a.
And you wouldn't work with them, or?
I would say that usually, in order to win, because it's one of the hardest things in this country to do, to have a labor union, right? To get our labor laws are so fixed against workers being able to achieve that, even though theoretically it's one of the missions of our country is that labor can organize, that people can organize, but the laws are so stacked against anybody being able to do that to do it is one of the most courageous things that any worker in this country can do.
Yeah, it seems like even the wording of how we talk about it these days is makes it an uphill battle. I mean, what? Are you against the right to work?
I am against right to work.
You're against right to work.
I am against right to work.
Why are you against right to work?
Right, and obviously it's one of those terms that is, a bit facetious in its wording, in that the right to work means that you don't have to join the union in order to work someplace, right? And you go, oh, well, that sounds okay. But then what happens is when I'm in the hiring process, that I only hire people who are anti-union.
Yeah.
Right, until the union gets voted out. And then, right, until there's a majority of those sorts of people.
And it seems like if people don't have to pay the union dues, then the union dissolves too.
Right, why should I pay if you don't have to?
And the libertarians seem to be very much for right to work bill, which essentially just makes it so that you can't have a contractual agreement. Is that right?
So in the private sector, right, it says that you can't have right, and that's one of the things that people don't understand about this, is that in order to have a union security clause, which is what it's called when everybody is in the union, right? That is negotiated by the workers and management. Both sides agree to that.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not something that just automatically comes with a contract.
That's why I'm kind of confused why there's this libertarian push. I mean, other than the fact that the Heritage Foundation is owned by the moneyed interest. Right. I don't understand how it equals up, because the contractual agreements between two parties seems like
it should be a totally libertarian thing, right?
Yeah.
And it's voted on by the workers, right? And so the workers can vote that down. They can take it out of the contract if they don't like it, right? All of those things can happen. And there's another equally onerous clause from labor's point of view called management rights, right? And so management has the rights in the contract to do all of these different things, to manage, to hire and fire and all these things, right? And those two clauses equal each other out, right? And so to legislate that something that a group of workers in a workplace decided to go for, negotiated with their employer, gave things up in order to get, because that's how negotiations work, voted yes that they wanted it in there again and again and again, right? And then you're going to say, oh, the 3 people who don't want it, though they should have a special law for them so that they don't have to be in the union. And it's clear, it's a longer discussion than we probably want to get into, but from the early 70s, there's a very clear decision that workers in this country have too much power, and that we need to figure out a way to take them down a peg, right? And so because if you're worrying about how you're going to pay the bills, you don't have time to worry about those pesky things like environmental laws.
Yeah, and it seems like you've been fighting a losing battle since you, as a labor organizer, I would imagine. I mean, they're not as strong now, are they?
So I was lucky enough to organize thousands and thousands of workers. And the interesting thing is that I came into the labor movement at a time when all of the exciting campaigns were with immigrant workers, right? And so the Justice for Janitor campaigns in DC and LA and airport workers and so largely immigrant-led campaigns. And here comes this kid from Maine who doesn't speak Spanish and only speaks some sort of poor French, right? And so when I came into the labor movement, I got sent down every dirt road you could ever want to get sent down, right? And so because that was kid from Maine, right? Send him to West Virginia, send him to wherever, right? And at the time, I sort of longed for those campaigns with the immigrant workers, right? I said, I'm going to work really hard in my career, and I'm going to be really successful so that I can get to those campaigns and run those campaigns one day, right? And so, and I was lucky enough to work with workers that were just incredibly courageous, incredibly brave, to be able to get together and say we have more in common than different, right? And we won a lot of times. I lost only a few campaigns, and so I was very lucky in that way, and that those campaigns that were often sort of written off were the people who were the most ardent. When you laid it in front of them, here's the really difficult things you'd have to do to get here, and if those people say yes, there's no keeping them from having a union, right? Because they're going to come together.
That seems to be Bernie Sanders' kind of strategy after this election, is go after the Virginia. He did a lot of big rallies there with
right, and that's the really ironic thing, right? That I realized after this election, is that I spent all those years fighting to get off those dirt roads, right? And I ended up working at a Justice for Janitors campaign in Boston. Was my last job as a union organizer, working with immigrant workers who'd come in and be like, the workers must be respected. And it's a Tuesday and nothing's going on, right? All the workers, everything that I always wanted to do. And then after this election, I realized that those dirt roads that I was going down at the beginning of my career, those were the roads we always needed to be going down to, and talking to those people about economic justice, and talking to the folks in the trailer at the end of that road about how to make their lives better and how to build power, right? And so, in some ways, I've kind of come full circle. And even though I'm a representative from Portland, I spend an awful lot of time talking to folks from CD2 and talking, to those reps and talking to the people in their districts. Because in my mind, if Maine doesn't rise as a state together, south and north, poor and rich, urban and rural, we're not going to make it.
How do you negotiate that South-North divide, or that Gold Coast?
So I'll give you a perfect example, right? So when we first decided and we set up our whole list of things, right? One of the things we wanted to do was to do something about affordable housing in Portland, right? And I have a lot of folks in my district who are in some of the worst housing in the city, and I have a lot of the folks who build who live on the East End who are contractors. And so I got to talk to both sides about the difficulty of building affordable housing from the contractor and developer's point of view, and the difficulty of living in sort of substandard housing that, where you've got the heat up to 70 in order to get it to 40, right? In the winter, and you're paying all the electric bill. So to put all of those things together, I realized as I went and talked to housing advocates, there was a time when all the forced evictions were happening. Right?
Yes.
And so everyone came back to the same thing. Well, we could do this, or this. We don't have money to do any of them, so it doesn't really matter. And so what I was able to sort of suss out of that was that what we needed was a revenue stream, right, that could be dedicated to affordable housing, to not only help folks who needed money with their rent, but to help people who own buildings fix the housing stock, which is what we want, because we'd love to have buildings with heat and hot water and crazy things like that, right? But if you put those things in, then you raise the rent $500, then the folks who are there can't live in that building anymore, right? And so without getting into the weeds, we decided that the local option tax, right, to be able to tax tourists who came in and stayed in our hotels and ate in our restaurants would be a great way to do that, right? But when you look at that, right, and that's great for Portland, but that bill has been put in every session for 30 years, and it's never come out of committee with a favorable vote, and it's never been passed, right? And so I started thinking, okay, why? And so I read through all the bills, right? Why did it get defeated and all of that, right? And what I realized was this, obviously, the split between those cities along the coast and in tourist areas that would be able to charge these tourists and everybody else who would never benefit from it. And so the cities that would never benefit from it would vote it down again and again and again and again, right? And so what we fashioned was a bill where a percentage would stay with the city that was charging the tourists, and then the other percentage would go to every other city to lower property taxes and to have microloans for small businesses, to be able to start cooperatives and to have training on how to run those businesses and to keep them afloat, so that the tourists' money would spread throughout the whole state. So everybody would benefit from every tourist that came into our state.
So how would this tax be instituted?
So basically,
to only hit tourists?
So hotel and food.
Hotel and food, okay.
Right, and you can, it's without getting too much in the weeds. A city could say it's just in the summer. They could do, lots of things.
Yeah,
right?
and you're going to submit this bill.
I did submit this bill, and I got it out of committee with Republican support, and I brought it to the House. I had the votes in the Senate, and I brought it to I thought anyway.
Yeah.
We'll never know exactly how that all would play out, but in the House, the representatives in one of the tourist towns decided to vote against it because they didn't get all 100% of it. They didn't want 65%, right? So now they have 100% of nothing rather than 65% of all.
I would imagine there must be some interests who are against it for the sake of the tourism industry. So,
but it's,
which actually is a topic I kind of was interested to talk to you about, because you're a big proponent of the referendum to increase the minimum wage, and I was kind of curious about your opinions on the tip credit. So you were against instituting the tip credit.
No.
Or you were for, I'm sorry, I always confuse the two things.
Yeah.
You're for it.
I was for it. This is something that I'd worked on for about 15 years in different ways. The idea that having a wage at your work as well that you could rely on, plus tips, right, was where the justice piece of it fell.
But so then when I looked into this, it seems like there's a pretty big majority of people, both owners and servers in the service industry, who are against, who were against the tip credit.
We had a 15-hour hearing on it.
So I was sort of, and it seems, and from what I read about that hearing, there's a lot, and then
a lot of servers who came out in support as well. Right, so that's the piece.
Okay, there were, but seems like but
a lot that came out against.
Yeah, and I went and talked to my first person servers, and everyone I talked to was against it, and their explanation was that there were some restaurants in Portland who did start paying their servers higher wages, but then they also said that told people who came there not to tip. And that was the sort of strategy of the owner, and that this is how it had to be because the margins are so. I mean, that's the argument.
Yep.
And it got me thinking that with this, how do you reconcile the fact that Maine is has such a big tourism industry, and does it seem like the restaurants and people who profit off tips are profiting off of the wealth disparity that exists in this country, and these, it seems like they don't really fit into a model of socialist wages. Does that make sense? They're sort of benefiting off the gluttony of America.
Sure. I mean, I can see what you're saying. I think that the laws exist in 7 other states. People still give tips. People don't stop giving tips. People, they make a living wage on top. And it's easy to say. People would come in and testify that, oh well, we never use the tip credit, so that shows that that it's not needed, right? That people don't need to have, right? This tip, because they make enough in tips, right? And so the way the tip credit works is if the minimum wage is $12, if I don't make $12 in tips, you have to make up the rest, right? That's the tip credit.
Yeah, yes, but it seems like in practice, and I noticed you had this interview with Rob Korobikin,
yeah.
And there was a point in it where you said that.
Well, you look at it, I'll just say one quick thing.
Go ahead.
Which is that the other thing that a lot of folks don't realize, and it got to be sort of a nasty gram throughout the legislature and partisan divide, is that the tip credit was started after slavery because people didn't, 2 industries didn't want to pay African American workers, newly released slaves, any wage, and that was the restaurant industry and the Pullman car, the train. They just wanted to be their workers to live off of the tips.
So right.
It's the only industry in this country where you don't have to pay a fair wage, and then because the customers pay the wage.
Yes, but it's still at the same time we have such a flourishing tourism industry in Portland that there are still many people who can subsist and favorably subsist off of good tips by people who are, which
during 3 months of the year, or maybe with global warming now 5 months of the year.
Sure, yeah.
Right, and then the rest of the time, when you talk, let's just to finish up the part about the tip credit, we never use it, right? Of course, at $5, because if I was making all I was making was $5 an hour in those jobs, right? Because they're very difficult jobs. So I'm making $200 a week or whatever. I'd go find another job. But $12 times 40 hours a week is a whole different situation, right? So if I'm not making, now I forget what the total was. What is that? 450, something like that, right? If I'm not making in the 400s, if that's what I'm supposed to make at $12 an hour, and I get brought up to that, I can count on that as a wage. So I understand that there was a whole, and I'll just say right out that the folks who did the organizing on that didn't talk to the workers.
Well, see, that's the thing you brought up in this interview with Rob, is you said industry propaganda comes out in every industry, but especially in hotels and restaurants. You just get indoctrinated over and over again. What is this industry propaganda? Is this?
So the Hotel and Restaurant Association, right, has been around since post-slavery, and their whole goal is to make sure that restaurants, right? I mean, and largely the chain ones now who pay most of the freight, pay as little as in taxes, as little in all of those things as they possibly can, right? Out of the belief that is necessary in order for that industry to exist. And yet in other countries, that doesn't exist. And now in these 7 states, it doesn't exist, right? And so it's sort of a fallacy. And so I think that from the minute that you come in, there's many things in the restaurant, in every industry, right, that you get told is just a reality, right? And often as Americans, we've sort of been beaten out of the asking questions, part that used to be such a vital part of our democracy, right? This is the way it is. This is the way it's always been, and that's the way it's going to stay, right? And why is it going to stay that way? Because that's the way it's always been.
Yeah. I guess, would you say that the argument, I mean, a lot of non-chain restaurants that are sort of that Portland's kind of known for, some of the greatest restaurant or such great restaurants that are individually owned. That I think a lot of those owners would say that there's a very low margin between, profit and so would you say that is also?
I'd say that
do you acknowledge that there challenge for small business restaurants?
Oh, of course, I'm a small business person.
Yeah, okay,
I own a small business.
Or for restaurants, when we say
right?
that.
But in restaurants,
can they afford to pay that?
In restaurants, have a set margin in their price that is their profit, right? If a price is this, you can go through that. There's a formula. It's this much for food. It's this much for labor. It's this much for heat. It's this much for rent. And then the profit margin gets added to that, and that's how you get the price of your steak, right? And so while that fluctuates, right? And so you can have a spike in the price of meat or the price of butter or the price of, right? That margin is built in to sort of eat that. And so, I would say, in my business, right, which is also a tourist business, a seasonal business, where I don't know, if it rains, I don't make any money, right? I pay my workers, the teenagers who work with me $15 an hour, I pay the adults who work with me $20 an hour, I have a sick leave policy, right? And I do that because those workers are who got me there. Those workers are who, put money in my family, so my family can eat. And I want to make sure that, not just a livable wage, right, but a justice wage is what I want to try to pay my workers. And so that, and so I think that it depends on your philosophy as a business owner. And there are businesses that are much harder than others to eke a profit out of, and I totally understand that. But I think at the same time, you can't do that on the back of your workers.
You brought up being a small business owner, and you seem like somebody who is very hardworking, very entrepreneurial in a way. Have you ever considered kind of just cashing in? Your talents seem to be suited to capitalism.
So when I left Boston, right, my last job there, I was the director for all the security officers, right, in all of downtown Boston, right, and the suburbs and everything. And so I worked with all of these companies, and one of the first things I did when I came in was I sat down with every one of these companies and I asked them, I'm a curious person, I guess, and I am curious about capital. And so I asked them, like, what are you trying to do? What's your goals? What are your margins? What are your troubles finding workers, right? Right? Because they would complain about this or that about the work, and I'd say, well, why do you think that is? Right? People are late. Why is it late? Why are they late? Well, because they have to drive in. They have to come in on the train from the suburbs. Well, why do they have? Because it costs too much to live in the city, right? Right? And so all of these sorts of things, and so that by the time we sat down to negotiate, I already knew what their ends were, right? I already knew what they were trying to achieve as a company, and they knew what I was trying to achieve, right? And we were able to come up with ideas like, we set up a program to work in the neighborhoods in the city, Roxbury, some of the other neighborhoods where we already had a lot of officers that worked, where they, rather than just sort of putting an ad in the newspaper, they would spend some time going into the community and doing two things. One, talking about these officers that they had and what a great job they do, and some of the things that happen every day where they help people, right? And then two, hiring from the community, understanding that there might be some additional work that needed to be done in order to have folks meet the level that they need to be able to be a security officer, right? So there might be literacy issues, there might be, right? But that those workers in the city who were living there could walk down the street to the building that they were going to work at, and have a wage, a livable wage with health care and all that, right?
Okay, yeah.
Right? And so that was our team, the workers, sitting down with management and solving a problem.
So it was your ability to understand the needs of management that helped with solving that problem.
I think, yeah, and I think that it's the same thing in politics.
Yeah. So you have these meetings. You meet with these CEOs. They're going to negotiate it all so they can keep their Rolls Royce or whatever. And have you ever thought to yourself, like, why don't I just negotiate for Mike Sylvester?
So that was
Where
the
are
point.
you?
So when I left, they all offered me jobs, right? Keep, right? And it's two things. One, I would be very ill-suited for, I hate enough putting on my suit to go to the legislature every day, but they make me, that's the rules. You gotta wear the suit, you gotta wear the tie, or you can't be on the floor of the House, right?
Yes, okay.
Right? So I do that, right? This is my uniform, right? I called Carhartt and asked them if they made a suit. Right?
Do they make a suit?
They don't,
They don't.
sadly.
Okay.
But I wanted one that said Mike right across it. But in any event, right? Those are the uniforms that we wear through life. But what I like is solving systems, right? And it's the same thing in my business, right? Trying to figure out how do I optimize things so that people come in, they get the best experience, right? All of those things are interesting, right? But part of that is, how do I treat my workers in a way that I can sleep at night and that they are happy to come to work here, and that that they see this as a place that they can feed their families, and that they, right? And all of that to me is what I saw in union contracts when it worked well. When it wasn't, I have to say 10 and you have to say 1 so we can get to 5, right? When we tried to solve problems. And and I'll be honest, I took a lot of grief for that that mindset. Right? Because it's much easier to yell and scream and have histrionics and end up in the newspaper for taking the extreme position, right?
Yeah, like Jimmy Hoffa.
Or even our own chief executive or our own president.
Oh, okay.
You see what I'm saying? In
yes.
in politics, it's much easier to just take some extreme position that doesn't actually solve a problem. Than to get together with people and talk about how to solve a problem.
And okay, moving to solving problems, being in the legislature.
Yep.
Who frustrates you more, Republicans or members of your own party?
I would say, this is personally, it's always the divisions in my own team that have frustrated me more, because I understand that the opposition is the opposition.
Yeah, and just to contextualize this one, you ran as a Democrat, but it's safe to say that you're Democratic Socialist.
I'm a Democrat, open Democratic Socialist. I said it on my signs.
Yeah.
People would ask me about it, and and I would say, Democratic Socialism is about government doing something that actually helps people, and them having a voice in saying what those things are that they need help with, right? Or that would make their lives easier, or that would whatever, right? And people would say, oh yeah, that makes sense, right? And my goal as a socialist politician is to do things that make sense, to have bills that help the whole state, right? To think about small business, right? And how to help Mainers get from here to there like I did, right? And to do that, and people say, oh, well, that's socialism, then that makes sense, right? It's just common sense that government has a role to help people, right?
Well, then there's people, I guess you must have encountered people in the legislature who say, no, that's not common sense. Or
Yes.
It's common sense that government has no role in people. We should unleash their creative potential.
And I think that when we get to it, right? So at the end of the session, when we were trying to solve the budget, right? And so there were a few people sitting in a room, and both sides sort of felt disappointed in what was going on in those rooms, right? We were all standing around for 10 hours a day with nothing to do but talking to each other, right? And so all of a sudden we went from moving 100 miles an hour in all these committees and bills and whatever to like standing around the hall talking. And so I had more conversations with Republicans during those couple weeks than I had had the whole session, right? I mean, and the reality is, right, when I came into the set, I was the dirty socialist from Portland, right? First time I spoke on the floor and I said the word union, there was literally a hissing
Really?
on the other side of the aisle, right? Right?
Who was hissing?
I won't call him out, but
Larry Lockman?
no, it was not.
Eric Brakey?
But that's a perfect example. Right? I serve on a committee with Larry Lockman, right? I serve, right? And so over that time, we would start talking, and we'd start with our disagreements, right? But by the time we got to the end, right, people would say, we'd look at each other and we'd say, if it was you and I trying to figure this out, we'd just agree on the things we could agree on, and then the other stuff, we just split down the middle, so everybody got a little bit of something.
So with a guy like Larry Lockman on this whole compromise thing, I think this is, are you comfortable agreeing with someone to say, let's agree to disagree on Islam being an awful, horrible religion with horrible people?
No.
But I'll go, how do you deal with a guy like Larry Lockman?
So there's two different groups, right? So there are people that I just disagree with to disagree with, right? Because what they say is so utterly opposed to what I believe that we're not going to get there, right? But I'll just give you an example, right? This last, when we went in for this first special session, right, it didn't end until midnight, right? I live on an island with a boat, so I ended up having to stay in Augusta. And I end up sitting next to a Republican legislator who, her and I have absolutely nothing in common. If you look at our voting record, we've probably voted on the opposite side on every single bill. But we sat together and chatted about our families and other things for about 10 minutes. And within that 10 minutes, we had a bill we could put in together because it turned out we both like tiny houses, right?
Oh. Okay, yeah.
Right? And that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about, where when you deal with people as humans, right? I didn't go into those meetings with those CEOs and say, let me tell you how it's going to be. I said, you got any kids? Right? What if you could wave a magic wand, what would you fix? Right? What are your dreams for this, for yourself, for this company? The same thing I would ask workers in their living room when we were talking about a union contract. And that's what if you can talk to people and deal with them in that way, 99% of the time we may disagree. But there's something out there that we can do together to help people, right? And what I find is...
What does Larry Lockman dream about when he goes into his coffin at night?
I will say this. So when I was having these discussions, people would say to me, oh, I bet you're going to go out and find a bunch of socialists like you to run for... And I said, no, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go and find Republican candidates. And they said, really? What, Republican candidate? I said, yes, and I'm only going to ask them one question. Is there anybody at home that loves you and would like to see you more? Because it seems like the folks who tie up all of these legislation and whatever have nowhere else good to be where somebody would like to see them. And the only thing they have to do is to obfuscate and to take these extreme positions in order to bring attention to themselves. And without naming any names...
You didn't name any names, I named names.
Yeah.
That's my own grudges.
Go on, right? I will say that the legislature has risen against most of those really extreme things.
Oh,
in
that's
bipartisan fashion to denounce it.
Do you feel like the legislature as a whole in Maine, since we've dealt with a governor who is very much like our president,
Yep.
Do you think that as a whole there has been a shift now towards civil servants respecting civility more?
Here's the thing about Maine, and it really surprised me, to be perfectly honest, because I lobbied for unions when I worked for the State Workers Union. I went and talked to all these legislators, and I had a sense that they didn't even read that bill. They don't even know it, right? And sort of this I don't want to say disdain, but I said I would never run to be a politician, right? And then I got all excited by Bernie, right? And he told us all to run, so I ran. I think that for the most part, and I say for the most part because there are those exceptions, people are up there because they're really trying to do good for people. And I was surprised at the amount of detail that people delve into, the amount of time they take, and the amount of thought that they give to their votes. Now, we hear the same exact things, and that people come to the decisions or the conclusions that they come to, hearing the same things I hear, right? I can't follow their logic in any way, but I know in discussing that they did have a thought process to get there, and at the base of their thought process most of the time, and then if you divorce the lobby from it, right, which is a whole other thing, right? They're trying to do what they think is best, and unfortunately, what happens a lot of times is they reach those conclusions, and then someone else who's paid to be there comes in and says, oh, no, let me tell you why you're wrong and why that's going to end up with a dirty postcard being in your mailbox saying that, you supported whatever, right? And that scares people off of their positions. Like, they give these lobbyists the authority, because they're, the association of whatever, right? That they are experts in it. But none of those people were elected to sit in that seat and pull the lever. And so to me, every time that you go against your conscience, whether it's a group that I support or a group that I don't necessarily support, right? I listen to all the information, but I care more about what my constituents say. I care more about what I told them that I was going to go there and do, right? And I care more, and I really don't care too much. I mean, there was... yeah.
You don't care about what the lobbyists are telling you.
I don't care too much about it. And the funny thing was, I wouldn't talk to them at the beginning, and then I ended up talking to one about a bill that I had they were supportive of. And then the word got out, Sylvester's talking. And so all of a sudden I had all of them talking to me, right? And I think...
So should we look forward to your tobacco and pharmaceutical
yes,
bills?
Yes, that's coming in next
forward?
session. That's coming in next session. But you know what? A lot of times it's interesting to hear what they have to say, even though I'm opposed to the viewpoints that they're bringing forward. And sometimes when we're on the same side, I have to rethink. I stop and go, wait a minute. They're testifying in support of what I, right? Like, should I, and really try. That's where I have to dig deeper to find out why, why are they supporting this bill? Right? It's easy to see why it's easy to oppose things.
Okay.
It's hard to build.
Is it? I believe you on that one. Thank you, Mike. We have to wrap it up now.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for
so
having me.
much for coming. Yeah.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Good night. Thanks, Mike.
Hey, no worries. That was fun.